Night held to Winterfell like a stubborn cold. The wind came in from the wolfswood and slid through arrow slits and under doors, carrying the dry, iron smell of old snow and the faint, damp breath of the hot springs that steamed beneath the keep. The yards were mostly empty by then. The last of the stable boys had banked the fires, and the guards tramped a slow circuit atop the walls, their cloaks snapping. In the God's Wood, the heart tree watched all of it with blind red eyes, and the dark pond kept its secrets. Jon Snow moved through that hush as he had moved through so many nights of his boyhood, careful, unnoticed, with an ear for the creak of a hinge or the cadence of a guard's cough. Ghost padded beside him, white as drifted snow and near silent. The direwolf's breath smoked in the cold, and Jon's lantern threw a small pool of honey-colored light over snow-crusted stone. He ought to have been sleeping. He ought to have been thinking of the morrow, of farewells and oaths and the road north with his uncle. The wall waited for him, huge in his mind the way mountains wait beyond every horizon, and part of him trembled with that hunger he'd never been able to name. But the other part, the mortal, unremarkable part that understood goodbyes, had driven him out beneath this hard sky and down the steps into the crypts, into stone and darkness and memory. The air changed as soon as he descended. The warm breath of the springs slid through cracks, turning the chill damp and faintly sweet, and the lantern light crawled over carved faces and the hint of bronze and rust. The statues were as familiar as any kin. The dire wolves at their feet, mouths closed, stone swords across stone laps. He passed the kings of winter and the lords that followed, and each seemed to watch him with blank, stern patience. Ghost's claws clicked softly. A drop fell somewhere. The sound echoed forever. He had come to the place he always came when the world felt too large, to the isle where Lyanna Stark lay beneath her own cold likeness, hair carved into a river down her back. A winter rose whispered onto the stone of her lap by the sculptor who had known, or thought he knew, what Eddard Stark's sister had loved. Jon had never asked his father why he came to the crypts so often alone. He suspected the answer without daring to voice it, the way a boy suspects the shape of the shadow he sees at the edge of his bed, and says nothing because saying a thing can make it real. Tonight, the lantern light trembled. Ghost sniffed and lowered his head, teeth bared in a silent way that was more curiosity than threat. There was a smell Jon couldn't name. Not rot, not the dust that clung to the crypt's old dead, not the earth smell of seepage. It was drier, clean somehow, as if a gust of air had slipped in from some other season. Jon set the lantern on the floor, the iron ring ringing softly on stone, and crouched beside Lyanna's statue. He laid his palm on the direwolf at her feet and felt the faintest whisper of warmth under the stone, the way one sometimes did in Winterfell, here and there, where the hot springs rose closest to the surface. He shifted, and when the lantern light swung, it cast a line of brightness into a crack he had never noticed at the edge of the dais. A fault in the floor? No. The seam had tool marks in it, very old and very careful. He slid his fingers into the gap and felt the roughness of fitted stone. It moved a hair under his hand. He said nothing aloud. The crypts were a place for silence. Ghost leaned close, huffing. It took more time than it should have to work the flagstone free. Whoever had fitted it had done so to keep out anything but patience. Jon pried with his dagger, and with a length of rusted iron, he found leaned against a statue farther down the aisle, worrying the stone back until it lifted, and the warm breath from beneath kissed his face. The smell came stronger then, clean dry, with some tang like old ashes and seashells left too long in the sun. The lantern showed a hollow no deeper than his forearm, an old cavity lined with smooth slate. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in rotten cloth. The weave surrendered under his fingers at once, turning to powder, exposing a second layer of oiled leather gone stiff as bark. He drew his knife and cut carefully. Something within glimmered like scales. He drew the first from its cradle, and the weight of it startled him. It filled both his hands like a newborn thing, heavy and stubborn. The surface was a mosaic of tiny plates, black upon black, but not a flat black. Light hid in the cracks and whispered out again, and when his lantern flame licked across it, it wasn't one color at all but many. A deep midnight scattered with red veining, faint as threads of smoke baked into glass. The egg, he could not name it anything else, was cold under his skin, then not cold, then cool again in a way that felt like breath held and released. There were two more in the cavity beside it. One was the color of a storm cloud lit by a winter twilight, iron gray with a sheen at certain angles that made John think of steel. The third was the palest of the three, a stony cream laced with green-black like pine needles burned into snow. He did not tell himself not to touch. He put one palm on each of them in turn, and the first cut came not from the edge of shell but from the weathered leather he had slit. He hissed and pulled back by instinct. A bead of blood stood brilliant on his skin, red like the veins in the black egg, and fell before he could think to stop it. It struck and spread like a ruby crushed into ice. It seemed to him the shell drank it. He told himself that was foolishness, a trick of light. The lantern sputtered and flared. Ghost's ears flattened. The dire wolf put his nose to the egg and huffed and then sneezed, offended and intrigued. John looked up at Lionel's face. Lantern shadow made the eyes deeper, and it was easy, too easy, to hear something that was not there. The thin echo of a woman's plea in his father's voice from long ago. He should fetch Luwin, he thought. He should fetch his father or his uncle or set the stone back in place and pretend he had never seen any of it. He had always been good at pretending the things he was not meant to see were invisible. Bastards needed that skill to breathe. But something older than sense, older than obedience, took his wrists. He wrapped the eggs again as best he could with the brittle leather and ancient cloth, and set them into the sack he had brought for nothing more than a bottle of cider and a heel of bread. The weight near tore the strap when he lifted it. He fitted the flagstone back, clumsy with haste and then slow with care, until the seam was once more a whisper in the floor. He picked up the lantern and stood. The statues said nothing. Ghost's tail brushed his knee. When he reached the stairs, he paused and looked back down the long aisle. The dark pressed against the lantern light, dutiful and patient. It struck him, for a heartbeat, that nothing about this place was surprised at him. The Crypts had been swallowing Stark secrets since there had been Starks to make them. He left the lantern with one of the watchmen when he came out into the yard. The man barely grunted at him and carried the sack the long way round. He did not take it to the little room he shared with Robb for fear Catelyn Stark's eyes would pass the threshold while they were at their last supper. He did not take it to the kitchens where heat might wake whatever patients slept in those shells. He went instead to the one place in Winterfell where no one entered unless they had reason: the broken tower. Years had weathered it since Bran's fall. Men had begun to brace one wall, and then the work had stopped, as if any hand that tried to set those stones to rights felt a shiver up the spine. The lowest rooms were dry enough and less drafty than a man would think from looking at the ruin outside. John dug behind a fallen lintel where heat bled up along the stone and made the air smell faintly of wet iron. He laid the eggs in the niche and bricked it over with loose rock and old mortar. Ghost watched with his pale eyes bright. The last bit of dust had hardly settled when a low voice spoke from the archway. It did not startle him. He knew that voice too well. "Whatever you are hiding in a broken tower at midnight, you mean to hide from me as well, I suppose?" Lord Eddard Stark said, quiet as snow. John's mouth went dry. He turned. His father stood without cloak, the cold putting color in his face, hair loose as if he had risen from bed and come at once. The weight of his gaze was never harsh. It was worse than harshness. "I was saying farewell," John said, and it was true if not complete. "To the place." Ned Stark looked past him at the stones John had jimmied into place. He did not step closer. He did not press. The years had taught John that his father had a talent for choosing what not to strip from a man. He stood there instead and watched Ghost, and let the silence stretch until it felt almost easy to breathe again. "The Crypts are a better place for farewells than this old ruin," Lord Stark said at last. John nodded. Words crowded and none of them wanted to be said. He tried. "When you come back from King's Landing." Ned Stark's mouth went a fraction thinner. The look was familiar as well. It was the look he wore when a thing had the shape of a choice and yet was not one. "I will be gone longer than I like," he said. "Robb will keep Winterfell for me. You will keep your vows for yourself." His eyes softened on the last, quick and almost flinching, as if he were a man who knew the taste of a blade he had put to his own tongue. I meant to find you in the morning. Since I have you in a broken tower at midnight, I will say it here. He stepped closer then, and his hand, warm from inside the hall, not thief warm from the springs, came to rest on Jon's shoulder. You will have no name but what you make, Ned said. No inheritance, no wife, no daughter to mourn you. That is the price of the wall. It is also its gift. You may be made hard by it or cleansed by it. Choose clean when you can. It was not the father's love Jon had wanted all his life. It was what Ned Stark had to give, and that had always been weight enough to straighten a boy's spine. I will, Jon said. He meant it. His father's hand tightened a fraction, then let him go. Ned Stark's gaze flicked, once only, to the stones Jon had stacked over the niche. The corner of his mouth turned in a shape not quite irony and not quite sorrow. Winterfell's bones hold too many things, he said, aloud to the cold and the ruin. Then he went away, quiet as he had come. In the morning the yard boiled with the things goodbyes always boil with. The awkwardness of men who spend their lives together and do not know how to speak when parting, the bustle of boys who make noise when they do not know how to think, the steady competence of women who know what to put in a man's saddlebags to keep him alive. Jon said nothing of broken towers or heavy secrets. He embraced a brother and was looked through by a lady, and bent to ruffle Rickon's hair and had the boy bite him for his trouble, fierce with 5-year-old grief. Arya clung to him with thin arms and a smell of sweat and horse and needle oil that never seemed to leave her these days. Take me, she demanded in a whisper. Please. I wish I could, little sister. He meant that as well. Grow fast. I'll come back with a bearskin, and you can wear it to supper to vex the septa. Arya snorted against his shoulder. When she let him go, she pressed something into his hand, quick as a cut purse. It was a bit of blue ribbon frayed at one end. For luck, she said, trying to make crossness of it and failing. You'll need it. I know how men are. He tucked it in his glove where the feel of it would bother him and remind him she existed. Robb grinned without smiling and thumped him and swore to write. Benjen Stark mounted up and lifted his chin at Jon in that way that said everything his uncle ever said. Keep pace if you can, boy. Ghost bounded ahead, white flashing against white. Winterfell fell behind them in gray stages and then not at all. The road narrowed under shadow. They were 3 days out before Jon let himself think of the broken tower at all. He did it by thinking only of one of the 3 shapes he had found in the crypt, the one that had seemed to breathe in his hands. It had seemed wrong to leave them all. It had seemed a kind of betrayal to take them. In the end, he had made a third choice which felt like a thing a bastard would do. The gray iron egg rode inside his saddlebags under a layer of wool. The weight of it made the horse's back a little stranger, and once or twice at a halt, he felt into the bag to be sure the thing had not decided of its own to go elsewhere. It stayed. At night by the fire, he brought it out and propped it under his knees and told himself nothing at all, only held it and let his hands warm and cool against the strange breath that was not breath. He did not show it to his uncle. You did not bring everything you were to men whose judgment you craved. That too was a lesson the years had already given him. It was Benjen who kept him from any foolishness of opening his mouth to Luwin before they left. The day after the discovery, he had half-formed the intention and turned toward the rookery, and then he had passed under one of the arches where the springs ran close and the stone exhaled warmth, and he had thought of the clean dry smell in the crypt. He had thought of ghost stories the old men told in the yard when the ale was good, stories of dragon lords whose palaces were warmed from beneath by the earth, who had kept their beasts where the rock sweated heat. He had thought of what it would mean to place such a weight into Maester Luwin's hands. Kind, puzzling hands that smelled of ink and charcoal, and seen only the path where a raven went south with a simple letter. Lord Eddard, your bastard has found nonsense in your vaults. Let me dispose of it. Jon had turned aside and gone to the broken tower instead. The wall rose as a cliff of blue in the mind long before it rose in the eye. Men on the road talked of it the way they talked of storms that were not yet here. Jon listened and said little. Benjen said less. Castle Black looked like a ruin because all sound places in the north looked like ruins in deep winter. The buildings crouched, hoods up, with smoke rising thinly, and the wall loomed behind them like a thing the world had built itself and then forgotten. The gate yawned black as a mouth. The wind came down from the ice with a voice. The gray egg did not like the wind. That was foolish, but Jon knew it as soon as he had it in his hands in the yard. The shell felt withdrawn, almost the way a horse lifts its skin to flick away biting flies. He wrapped it again and carried it to the small cell the stewards showed him. There was a table there and a straw mattress and a shelf with a crack big enough to be a second door in hard weather. He could hear men beyond, voices and the scrape of boot heel on wood. Ghosts prowled and lay down and got up and prowled again. The smell of the place was different from Winterfell's. There was no breath of the springs here, no old familiar damp. Smoke, leather, oiled wood, men. He brought the egg to the hearth at night and kept it where he could feel the heat through his boots. He thought no one saw him. He was wrong about that, as young men often are. It was Samwell Tarly who stood too long in the doorway and looked with his round, soft face like he had stumbled onto somebody's prayer. Jon had not intended to like Sam. Liking people had never gone well for him when he'd expected it to. The boy had made it difficult not to. He was a coward by his own declaration, and yet kept showing up again the next morning, shaking and wet-eyed but breathing. Cowardice like that was a kind of courage in a man who had been raised to different seasons. "What is it?" Sam asked, hushed as if the thing atop the hearth were sleeping. "A stone from home," Jon said. He sat with his forearms on his knees, looking down into heat that bit his shins. "It reminds me what warmth feels like." Sam studied him, and then the egg, and then him again. He had a knack for letting silences fill the shape they wanted. "I've seen a picture of one of those," he said at last. "In a book, from across the sea." "I don't read pictures," Jon replied, more softly than his words. "Keep it to yourself." Sam nodded at once, in the way of boys too used to keeping things unsaid. Castle Black taught in small, harsh lessons. Alistair Thorne's tongue was a lash, and decent steel did not grow out of a scold any more than wheat grew out of winter. But men learned to parry anyway because there was nothing else. Jon bled and laughed and swore and bit his shame when it came. At night his hands went to the egg, as if something in him had decided this was one of the things a man did in order to be able to rise again in the morning. He began to dream, not like Bran in his wolf way, but vivid nonetheless. He dreamed of halls beneath the earth shot with hot rivers. He dreamed of a woman he had never seen with hair like night and eyes like a storm standing above a sea he had never known. He dreamed of a tower where wind sang and sang and sang until the stone remembered a different song and rang an answer. He stopped telling himself the dreams were nothing. The north was full of unwise men who had called dreams nothing. The raven came late in the afternoon with the snow blowing sideways across the yard. The bird would not go to anyone's hand but Eamon's. The old maester's blind eyes were clear as milk. He stood while the raven fluttered and croaked, and then he kept his face very still. Jon was not there in the rookery to see it. He heard about it that night. The news passed like water from hand to hand, every man's mouth wearing a different cup, and kept very quiet while his hands shook inside his gloves. What the men said was that the hand had been arrested. What the men said was that the hand would lose his head. What the men said was that nothing in the South ever stayed true once a king had died, and kings were always dying. He went to Maester Aemon because there were not so many men in Castle Black with a voice that did not taste of iron, and because a man goes to a fire when he is cold. The old man sat in the warm chamber where the rookery stairs came up, with his cup near the coals and his hands wrapped in a blanket. Jon had never loved anyone immediately. He had made a habit of warning his heart against such waste. The first time Aemon had spoken to him, that habit had suffered a small quiet cut. "Jon," the old man said without turning his blind face. It was uncanny, that sense he had of men in a room with him. "You have had a hard letter." "I didn't have one at all," Jon said. He stood because sitting would have required more tact than he could afford. "The hard letter was in every man's mouth." Aemon nodded. "Grief belongs to the living," he said. and the living forget that as easily as they forget the taste of last summer's plums. He listened to Jon not speak for a time and then went on, mild and inexorable. You brought something north with you that did not want to be cold. Jon looked at the old man's hands. They were thin and clever. He thought of the egg. He had told Sam to keep it. He had told himself he would tell no one else. And now here he was in a warm room with a man who had once stood much nearer to thrones than any Stark ever had. And the words rose anyway. I don't know what it is, H. He said, low. I found 3. In the crypts. I left 2. I brought 1. It seemed wrong to tell anyone, and wrong not to. Eamon's breath made a soft sound. Not laughter, not surprise, something else. You have a talent for the narrow path, it seems, he said. Many men believe that dragons are as dead as the kings who built the wall. Many men have believed many convenient things. He drank, the cup trembling faintly in his hand. May I touch it? Jon hesitated only as long as shame demanded. He reached into the sack at his feet and lifted the egg as carefully as he had lowered it there. It felt briefly heavier, as if reluctant to leave its nest, then settled into his hands like a familiar dog adjusting to a lap. Eamon's fingertips brushed the shell and stilled. He did not stroke it. He did not handle it as if it were a curiosity. He held the pads of his fingers upon it as a man might lay his palm upon a grave. Oh, he said softly, that was all. Maester? Jon asked, the old title awkward around a younger man's throat. Eamon's blind eyes shone with something water had not put there. There are old songs in this, he said. I was born to one. I left the song and the song left me, and now it hums again. You remind me of a truth I had sworn off for the sake of peace. Nothing that is wound tightly ever unwinds of its own. He drew back a fraction, and his expression, whatever it was, did not change. Whatever you do with this, he said, it will do something with you. There is no path where you remain unmoved. I didn't bring it to be unmoved, Jon said, with more fierceness than he had intended. I brought it because it called to me, and because I'm a fool. Most men who change the world start in foolishness. Eamon's mouth twitched. The question is whether they are content to end there. The spring returned late that year and briefly, as if winter had consented to a truce. The snows went slushy and then refroze meanly. The last week of the moon turned the yard to glass in places and the men to cursors when they slipped on it. The night the thing happened, the castle slept with one eye open. There had been a body in the morning, Arthur, brought back from beyond, dead and wrong. Aemon had warned, Mormont had ordered, Thorne had scoffed. After sundown, while the men slept and the wind toyed with the eaves, Arthur rose in the room where they had laid him and broke the fingers of the man who had set him there. Jon did not see the first part. He woke to the scream. He was running before he remembered he had risen. The hall hammered under his feet. Ghost shot past him in a white blur. Men were pouring into the passage with him, half-armed and half-dressed. Some had no blades at all and were holding whatever came to hand. A poker, a stool leg. The smell hit first. Cold like iron, real as a blade in the mouth. Men crammed outside the old bear's door, and then the door itself burst outward and Mormont staggered through as if shoved by a mountain. There were too many bodies and not enough space. Jon didn't think. He slammed his shoulder into a man who had frozen, made the opening wider, and Ghost went low and white under swaying legs and snarled a rusty tear from something that should not have had flesh left to give. There was a crash like a shelf coming down, and men shouted with voices that were all boys again. The thing came out into the passage, hunting the heat of living breath. Its eyes were blue as winter never was. It smelled of the grave and of something clean that made Jon's molars ache. Fire, a man was yelling. And in his mind Jon heard not that man but Aemon's patient voice saying that some truths have no enemies but time. He snatched at a lantern, his glove hissing, and flung. The lantern burst, and flame hooped up. Oil crawled over the thing's clothes and then into the thing itself, as if the fire had grown teeth. Men stamped and shouted and scrabbled, all of them suddenly wise to the oldest lesson there is. Mormont sat against the wall wheezing, cursing men for clumsiness as if cursing were breath. Jon bled a little and did not know where. He stood with his hands shaking and the taste of iron in his mouth and watched the way the blue went out in those impossible eyes. Back in his cell, the egg was not where he had left it. That was impossible. He had set it on the hearthstones, close to the coals where the warmth would soak into it. He crossed the floor and dropped to a crouch and reached beneath the chair, and there, at the edge of a coal that had rolled under, lay the egg with its shell gone from cool to hot. He did not snatch. He put his hands around it and felt heat that should have burned him and did not. The shell had hairline seams across it like the rents in river ice when the thaw speaks underneath. Jon held his breath without meaning to. He heard nothing at first but the susurrus of his own pulse and the wind under the door. Then a sound came, thin and insistent and heartbreakingly determined. Top, top, top. He did not pray. Bastard's prayers had always felt like petitions mailed to the wrong gods. He crouched there on the floor with the heat washing his face, and Ghost stood at his shoulder as if carved there by a careful hand, and Jon watched a crack become a line and a line a gap. The first bit that fell away was no bigger than a thumbnail. It was dark on the outside and pearl pale within. Something moved in that narrow dark. It moved like a stuttering flame. The creature that pushed free was ugly, and then it was not. It was wet and furious and opened its mouth as if the world had insulted it by existing without it so long. It was not large. It fit into both Jon's hands, and then its ribs flexed and it made itself longer by sheer belief. Steam rose off it. Its wings were half-transparent, tight as a drumhead, every vein a map. Its body was gray-black, and an iron sheen ran along the edges of its scales, so that when it moved it was as if armor were learning how to breathe. It made a sound like the crackle of a coal bed in a great hall and blew nothing but heat, as if the idea of fire lived already in it, aching to be born. Ghost huffed. The hatchling tilted its skull and hissed, not afraid and not friendly, simply there. Jon had planned nothing for this moment. He had imagined it and not imagined it 1,000 ways, and they all fell away like shutters from a lantern when the flame inside finds air. He raised the tiny thing with both hands and it climbed his palms as if his fingers were a series of low warm hills it meant to cross. The membrane of its wings stroked his skin. It blinked with a second clear lid. It looked at him. He had known few looks that made him want to weep. Arya's first bandy-legged colt. Robbed the night they'd gone down to the crypts and said all the names of the kings of winter with the solemnity of priests. His father on that winter morning in the broken tower. This, though, felt like grief turning its face and allowing him, for once, to see that grief had a brother. When he could move again with any grace, he wrapped the hatchling in his cloak and carried it like contraband through a castle black that had not yet recovered from its own fright. He went to Aemon because some part of him had decided to do so before he had known he would ever need to. "I have done something foolish," he said when the old man opened his door as if he had been waiting. The cloak wriggled once and then fell still. "And very possibly wrong. Those two are often companions," Aemon said mildly. "Come in. Shut the draft." The old man's hands were steady when he touched the little beast. He did not smile. He did not flinch. He inclined his face as if listening to rain, and the hatchling hissed once and then, astonishingly, settled his jaw along the ridge of Aemon's knuckles as a cat might with a trusted chair. "Ah," said the old man, with a crack in his voice like the end of a long winter. "So, the song is not yet finished after all." "I should send for the Lord Commander," Jon said, because that was what a man who kept oaths did when something of the realm's safety and peril fell into his hands. "You should," Aemon agreed, "and you should tell him the truth, and then you should help me plan how to keep a small thing from freezing to death when it has been born in the wrong place and the wrong time and yet perhaps exactly the right hands." Mormont came the way Mormont always came, like a bear who had been roused from proper sleep and meant to make the waking worthwhile for someone. The old bear's hair was singed in one place near his temple. His eyebrows smelled faintly of lamp oil. He looked at the small black creature hissing on Aemon's blanket and swore softly in a way that suggested he'd already exhausted louder options. "That," he said, "is a story that should have died with my grandsire's grandsire." It did not, Eamon said. It preferred to wait. Stories are sly like that. Mormont looked at Jon the way men look at a knife, with appreciation and suspicion. Boy, Lord Commander, Jon said, trying to stand straighter without jostling the clutch of warmth near his ribs. The hatchling had wriggled under his cloak again, seeking heat. Jon did not mind the desperate claws. Let him have every scrap I am, he thought, surprising himself. Is there any reason, Mormont asked, why the world should hear of this from another mouth first? Jon thought of letters. He thought of Southron kings who made a hobby of swallowing things they did not understand and calling it governance. He thought of a warded crypt, and a broken tower, and a blue ribbon in his glove, and of Eamon's blind gaze that saw too much of certain things. No, he said. No, Lord. Good. Mormont scratched himself under his singed eyebrow and winced. If the realm hears, it hears from me, and it does not hear yet. I'll have men fighting over it like dogs over a butcher's bones, and we have enemies enough without that problem. There will be whispers, but there are always whispers. Let them call it a trick and go back to their cups. Let them say we are all mad up here. That story serves us. Eamon tilted his head. There is a second matter, he said. The keeping of a fire-breathing creature in a keep built to be a bulwark of ice presents what one might call technical challenges. Mormont stared at the old man and then at Jon and then at the little dragon who had worked free of the cloak's edge just enough to glare at the Lord Commander with the full injustice of the newborn. He said at last, in the tone of a man placing a very heavy stone with careful hands atop a wall. It does. They made a nest in one of the old stores where the springs ran near the surface and the floor sweated warmth as Winterfell's did, though faintly. It had been used once for keeping apples, and the smell of them rose under the new stink of singed straw and old bones when the hatchling's temper got the better of him. Sam brought parchment and charcoal and wrote every observation down as if anyone would ever care. He cared. He tickled the edge of one translucent wing with cautious wonder and then yipped and hopped backward when the little creature snapped. Then he laughed at himself, which was something not many men up here knew how to do. They fed him on scraps of meat warmed over coals. When Ghost came near, he bristled and hissed. And then one day Ghost's patience evaporated and the white wolf bared his teeth and made a noise so low it was almost a vibration through the floor. The hatchling went utterly still. Jon held his breath. Ghost blinked and lay down at a challenging angle, paws crossed. The hatchling considered the white wolf gravely for a very long time and then walked over as if they had arranged this lesson privately. He curled against Ghost's flank and shut his eyes. Ghost rolled them in a long-suffering way at Jon. Jon had to put his fist in his mouth to keep from making a noise a boy would make. The news out of the south ran like dirty water through a leaky gutter. The king dead, and then the hand accused, and then the hand dead. Jon did not weep. He had cried for smaller things in his life and been ashamed later and loved himself less for it. This felt too large for tears. It felt like stone, like something that had been holding up a corner of his world had been taken away and replaced with air, and it would be ill luck to notice the missing weight too strongly lest the whole thing choose that moment to remember it was badly made and collapse. He took the dragon down to the warm room after Ghost had gone stiff-nosed and silent and refused to move from the threshold. The hatchling had learned to cling to Jon's shoulders and to the leather at his elbows and to the back of his neck without drawing blood. His weight was more than it had been. His breath was hotter. He had not yet made flame. He tasted at the air as if unsure the world was not something a throat might close upon. "You will need a name," Jon said aloud in the warm darkness, because naming things was part of holding them to the living world, kept nightmares and grief from unmaking them. He ran through names from tales and names from old Stark ledgers and names he had heard in the yard and discarded them one by one. He thought then of the place where he had found the eggs, of stone and silence and a rose carved where no rose could grow. He thought of iron and winter, and of the clean taste on the air when the shell had cracked. "Iron," he said first, and the hatchling hissed his disdain. "Winter," a little bored yawn. Jon smiled in spite of himself. Then "Ember," he tried half in jest. The hatchling lifted his head and made a small pleased sound as if a coal deep inside had turned over. "Ember," Jon said again, because a thing that nods to fire and to the smallness that still devours kindling felt right. You'll outgrow it, he murmured, rubbing the edge of the jaw with one finger. We do not choose the names we outgrow. Eamon's cough was soft. He had the knack of appearing in a doorway invisible to every other sense until he chose not to be. Ember, he repeated. A modest name, sensible. Do not trust sensible names. I don't trust anything, Jon said without bitterness. Good. Trust is for men with certainties. Eamon sat with a grateful groan as his joints remembered their age. The old bear is already calculating. He wants to take a ranging before the next hard freeze. He believes this will change the balance. He is not wrong. The blind eyes tipped toward the little dragon. Fire counts. It always has. In the weeks that followed, it became impossible and then second nature to conceal Ember. Men saw what they wanted to see. They heard ghosts huff as a draft. They smelled singed straw and blamed a clumsy steward. The stewards themselves learned, without being told, that there were places where their hands need not go. They were not blind either. The wall had raised generations of men to be canny with ignorance. Jon trained and bled and learned how to be kind without condescension to boys who were slower with a blade and quicker to anger. He learned the shape of the yard's wind. He learned where he was most likely to be struck. He learned to hold his tongue when Alistair Thorne tried to make him waste it. He learned to laugh with PYP, to nudge Gren out of stupid quarrels, to listen when Sam had read some strange, old thing that might in the end save him. He learned to hold warmth under his ribs like smuggled gold. He wrote no letter to Rob. He could see no version of the letter that did not betray something or someone. He wrote no letter to his father's memory. He went in the cold to the top of the wall at night and looked out, and in certain lights the ice caught stars and held them, and he thought, once only and not again, that perhaps the wall and a dragon had been meant to look each other in the eye. The day Ember first made flame, there were witnesses whether Jon would have chosen them or not. Sam was there with his trailing quill. Eamon was there with his old man breath and the patience of one who had been waiting all his life for small things to keep their promises. Donal Noy limped in, muttered something about stealing heat, and stood in the doorway with his arms folded and an expression that had kept green boys from braining themselves with hot iron for years. Jon knelt with a strip of meat pinched between two fingers, as he always did. Ember seized the meat with a ferocity that would have made Ghost look lazy, and then the little beast's throat worked in a queer way and he paused and made a frustrated look that was almost human. The sound he gave then was not the crackle of coal, but a high thin thread like the moment before a summer storm rolls its weight over you. Heat flared. Not much. Enough to blacken Jon's glove and make Sam squeak and Donal Noy say something approving and unprintable under his breath. Eamon's face went still the way it had gone still at the Raven. He did not say, ah. He did not speak at all, as though the old words he might have said belonged to other berths and other rooms and other boys and were not to be spent here. The ranging left 5 days later in a rasp of leather and a crunch of frost. Jon left Ember at Castle Black because the cold beyond the wall moved different, as if it were a living thing that did not want to be seen and meant harm. He left Ember because the little beast still needed heat more than glory. He left Ember because Mormont told him to. Those reasons made poor company in the night and better company in the dawn. They rode through a world that had had its color taken and worn thin. Jon did not need anyone to tell him they were not alone. Ghost ranged and came back, white as the breath of the men, and once stood stock still and did not move until he moved again, and Jon felt the echo of that stillness in his bones. At the fist they found old shapes that were young men once. They found stones arranged by hands that understood circles. They found things in the snow that made Sam's fingers shake on his quill and his jaw clench, hard for a soft boy. There are stories the North tells itself in order to keep living in this place, and some of them are true. Jon learned the difference in those days. He learned that the white cold can come at your back as well as your face, and that some enemies do not mind if your blade is good, because there are no edges that cut them. He learned that fire is a language, and that the men who do not speak it go quiet in the end and make poor listeners thereafter. When they came back, some fewer, some wiser, some not at all, Castle Black looked small and dear. Ember had grown. He made a sound when he saw Jon that was not a noise Jon had ever heard him make. It knocked something loose in Jon, some heavy bit that had been used to being stuck for too long. He laughed like a boy. He let the small dragon climb him and scratch him and scorch the air with a jet that was suddenly not small and then, as suddenly, faltered because the world always sets its limits, and patience would be required again. Letters took their time to arrive and more time to be trusted. Robb was king in the north. Winterfell kept its name and then did not. There were crows at the wall and crows south of it, and some men called other men crows like a kindness and some like a curse. Jon learned to keep his face when men spat. He learned to keep it when men called him brother with a feeling he had never expected to know. In the nights there were other dreams. He walked the crypts again in his sleep and found the flagstone gone he had replaced with such care. In the hollow the oiled leather had been cut anew by a careful hand. He reached and found nothing where something should have been. He woke with his hand clenched and the smell of snow in his nose, and ember, warm along his ribs, hissed a question. When word came of Winterfell's fall and burning, Jon sat in the dark for a long time with his hand in Ghost's coat. He said no eloquence. He thought of a broken tower and a niche behind a lintel and the way the stone poured his warmth back into his fingers if he was stubborn enough to hold still. Donal Noy said later in the yard, as if he and Jon had been speaking. Steel is steel in fire. It forgets its shape and remembers a better one. If it does not break, anyway. Some of us break, Jon said. Donal said again. And some of us take the break and use it. He did not ask Jon what he meant. The men up here had learned the trick of not asking things they had no need to hear and could not bear to know. The next winter night, the wall found its voice. The wind came down with malice and something else rode it. The bells at the gate were ringing with the wrong rhythm. Men's hands jangling them too hard because men were running too hard. There was a sound with the wind, like a far-off thin choir that had never learned a human scale. Jon did not think. He did not dress fully. He took Ember because the thought of leaving him was like the thought of leaving one of his hands, and because even if the small dragon provided nothing but a torch's worth of light, it would be something. Ghost was already gone. A white arrow shot into darkness. There were shapes beyond the ring of fire the men had thrown up, more shapes than any tale said there should be. The dead do not mass like that unless something tells them how. Jon saw blue and thought of the night in the old bear's hall and understood that night had been the kindest lesson the others meant to give him. He saw the men who had not expected to face it and nearly pitted them. He saw Sam, breathing like a bellows and gripping the obsidian blade they had made as if it were reason itself. Ember made a small strangled sound and then opened his mouth with a decision that was not small. Flame came. It came imperfect as all new things do and then steadied into a cone that made the little beast's whole body taut and bright. Heat shoved at Jon's face with a lover's palm. The nearest white, all stiff wrongness and malicious hunger in a shape that had once had a name, went down into ash with an indignity that would have made it hateful if it had been a man. The others themselves drew back from the flare, graceful and contemptuous as winter kings. Jon thought he saw one's face change a fraction, the way an aristocrat's mask might change the first time he sees a dog leap a hedge he thought impassable. Again, Jon said, and he could not have said later whether he spoke to the dragon or to himself or to the wind. Ember spat another lance of fire. Men shouted. The wrong choir faltered, then swelled, and cold went to war with heat as old as any song. In that moment Jon felt a kind of laugh rise in him that had nothing to do with humor. Felt like a lock turning. He had thought once that perhaps the wall and a dragon had been meant to look each other in the eye. Now he thought, no. The wall had been meant to have a word to answer with all this long time. When dawn grayed the ice and the dead lay quiet at last, men moved with the cautious gait of the spared. Eamon sat with his hands folded, his lips moving on a prayer that had nothing to do with any sept a Southron man would recognize. Mormont's hair had gone a little whiter somewhere in the small hours. He stood, surveyed the yard, and then put his hand once, briefly, on Jon's shoulder in a way that felt different from command and older than gratitude. "We will not keep the secret much longer," he said. His voice was a bear's voice after a hard fight. Word runs faster than men. And we will need more words besides. But you bought us the time we needed to find them. Ember nosed at Jon's jaw and made that small satisfied noise that had first made itself known to him in the warm room when heat and hunger had been the only gods either of them answered to. Jon scratched the coarse small scales and felt the heart hammering there under his hand like a smith at his day's work. In the days that followed, ravens went out with messages that said as little as they could and all the truth they had to. Men came to the yard and stayed or did not stay. Some left their old names and took up new ones with bad grace and then with good. They were not enough and then they were exactly all there were, as such men always are. Jon slept when he could. In the sparse mornings he walked to the parapet and looked north and thought of the other 2 eggs sleeping under Winterfell or not sleeping or shattered or stolen. This ignorance was a tooth he could not keep his tongue from. He thought of a promise his father had carried down into stone and kept there until it grew too heavy to bear alone. He thought of Lyanna's hands transformed into carved stone by a man who had never seen them, and of the way the cold takes everything you do not guard. In one dream he walked the crypts again and did not carry a lantern. The statues glowed faintly from within as if each held a coal under its ribs. Lyanna's rose had changed somehow. There were 3 petals where before there had been 1, and then no petals at all, only the suggestion of the thing. He knelt and put his hand to the flagstone and it was warm, the sort of warmth that means life somewhere near but not near enough to touch. He woke and the room smelled faintly of apples and ash, and Ember had dragged an old cloth into a careful circle and was worrying it into a nest as if that would keep the world from any harm. There are stories the South tells itself as well. In the South they say dragons are for kings and kings are for cities, and the wall is a tale men used to frighten children into faith. In the South they say winter is a season. Jon watched his breath pluming in front of him and listened to the sound of men mending what had been broken while they waited for something much colder than a season, and he smiled a little without humor. Let the South keep its gentler stories as long as it could. Sam stood beside him one morning, pale as always in the light and puffing as if he had climbed a longer stair than he had. "You think of it every time you look north," he said. "I can tell." "The eggs," Jon said. He leaned his elbows on the cold stone. "There were 3. I keep seeing them. I keep seeing a hand that is not mine sliding the stone aside." "Perhaps the hand was yours," Sam said. "And you only aren't there yet." Jon looked at him. Sam looked uncomfortable at his own courage and then shrugged as if to throw it off his shoulders. "I've been reading the old books," Sam went on. "Not the ones that talk about dragons like they were only ships. The other kind. There are tales of clutches failing and clutches waiting. There are songs, really old ones, where a thing sleeps until the world remembers to call its name." "What name does the world call?" Jon asked. Sam smiled quickly. "Whichever names we give it, I expect." Jon thought of Ember, of the way the little beast came at the sound of his step well before he could have learned the sound, as if the sound had been in him all along. He thought of how easily the old man's fingers had found the egg, blind, over cracked leather. He thought of the blue ribbon in his glove and the rough palm on his shoulder in the broken tower and the wrong choir in the wind and the way of heat. He thought of saying nothing. Then he did not. "When the time comes," he said, and the words were to Sam and to the wind and to the road, "I'll go south." Sam looked admirably unsurprised. "When?" he asked. "When the wall can afford it," Jon said. "When the old bear says it. When the winter is not in the very hall. When there is any chance at all of getting there and back and making more help than harm. When I have something that may wake what sleeps." He let his breath out, "A ghost. When a brother is called. I don't know, but I will." Sam nodded solemnly, as if Jon had declared an intention to grow a second heart. "I'll write it down," he said, and something in Jon's chest eased because someone would. That night Ember slept with his head tucked under Jon's chin and his claws pressed carefully into Jon's shirt, so he might not tumble when the boy turned. He made small noises when he dreamed, and once he spat a stutter of heat against Jon's skin that was no more than a kiss of warmth, and Jon laughed, silent and grateful, and wrapped his arm around the hot coil of him as if the warmth might stay under his ribs when morning came. Winter took the days and pressed them thin. Men carried wood up from the forest and laid it in neat stacks and then discovered that neatness is a kind of prayer, and they needed prayer, so they did it again. Letters came, folded like birds who had flown through storms. One said that Robb Stark had won a field with courage. One said that Winterfell had burned. One said that Winterfell had not burned, that a trick had been played with a pair of murdered boys. One said that a boy with no banner and many mothers in taverns had sworn there were dragons again and laughed his way into a purse. Truth picked needles out of those heaps of wool as it could. Jon took what truths he could find and set them in himself like nails in a door. On a day when the air lay still and heavy as iron, he and Mormont stood at the top of the wall and looked north. The chief thing the North teaches a man is the size of the world, and the second thing it teaches is the size of himself. Jon felt both fully, then, and not as a shame but as a mercy. He could be small and still hold something that threw light. "Your little beast will not be little forever," Mormont said, squinting into a distance that had ceased meaning distances long ago. "No," Jon said. "You'll need to make choices when it stops being small enough to hide," the Lord Commander said. "Some of them will be yours. Some will be made for you by other men's fears." "That has always been true," Jon said, thinking of a hall full of men who would not speak his name and a lady who saw through him. "The only new thing is that I'll be carrying fire when they do it." Mormont laughed, a bear's rumble. "Aye," he said, "and that will warm you some and singe you more. Keep your eyebrows, Snow." Jon smiled and did not look to see whether the old bear had meant to make him do it. In sleep that night he walked a wood not the gods would, and not unlike it. The trees were wrong. Straight where they should have been twisted, dark where red was wanted, and the leaves whispered with a dry silkiness that made his teeth ache. He smelled brine and spiced smoke. He pushed past a curtain and stepped into a hall where the air trembled with heat, and there was a girl with hair like night river and skin the color of summer wheat lying with her cheek upon a stone that hummed its own deep, patient note. She looked up as if she had felt his footfall rather than heard it. There were 3 small shapes near her elbow arranged like guttering candles before a shrine. He woke with the feeling of being watched, not by eyes that meant harm but by the future, which is a harder gaze to bear. Ember stirred and resettled. Ghost lifted his head, laid it down and sighed. Jon turned to the wall in the dim and pressed his hand flat against the cold stone, as if he could turn stone to warmth with a palm. The ice took it and gave back nothing, and the giving back nothing steadied him. The world would not be toppled by his wanting. He rose before dawn and went down to the warm room. Ember slunk after him, a length of black-gray heat in the half-light, wings tight against his sides to keep them from knocking shelves or men. The springs breathed through the cracks in the stone as they always had. The straw rustled. A drop fell somewhere, that endless crypt echo in a place that was not a crypt. "Come on then," Jon said to the small shape at his heels. "Let's see if we can make a morning fit to hold." The dragon huffed a spark onto the coals as if in agreement. Jon laughed quietly and laid the kindling carefully, the way Donal Noy had taught even a bastard to lay it so a fire would catch. He thought, as the flame took, that a world that had forgotten certain names had begun to remember them. He thought that Winterfell kept its secrets in stone, and that stone had finally returned one, dear-bought and well hidden, at the only moment it could matter. He thought of the hand that would one day slide back the flagstone he had set and of what waited underneath, sleeping or broken or stolen, and felt no fear that he would not be there when it happened, because there are threads that pull men across leagues more surely than chains. He thought of brothers and crowns, and girls who made knives of needles, and an old man who cradled a dragon with a tenderness learned too late in a life, and of a bear who had put his hand for an instant on a boy's shoulder because boys sometimes build walls in themselves the size of the one outside. "Ember," he said then, and the little beast turned his head, bright-eyed and proud. Jon held out his arm. The dragon climbed, claws setting, wings spreading a little for balance. The heat of him went through leather and shirt and skin to his very bones, and Jon stood in that warmth in a world that made a habit of cold and let himself be warmed. By the time the day broke fully, men were already at their work. They would hammer and mend and sharpen and carry. They would die foolishly and bravely. Letters would come, and in them both lies and truths in equal number. Kings would suffer their small godhoods, and the North would make no idol of them. Somewhere under stone, something slept and dreamed of the hush before the first breath. Somewhere over sea, someone else fed a fire with patience and thin meat. The wall glowed faintly blue where the sun caught it, as if it had its own sky to keep. Jon stood on the threshold between fire and ice and held a creature of both and neither, and felt, not for the first time, but perhaps for the first time without shame, that he too was made of such a joining. The snow began again, light as ash. It fell in the yard on men's shoulders and on steel, and it fell on the curve of a hatchling's back as he lifted his head to taste the air. He sneezed, offended, then hissed at nothing in particular, which was a language the wall would learn again in its own good time. Jon smiled without knowing he had done it, and stepped forward. The day made itself around him. The flame took, the wind sang. Somewhere far below stone remembered a warmer, older name, and above them all the world turned, slow and inexorable, as if a great hand had set it and then left it to its own stubborn work.